After all, we didn't get any change at all from Barack Obama. But, I wanted to talk on this podcast about Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is in the news again because they're now defaulting on a major debt payment that was due today. And so there's a lot of articles written about it. And of course, Congress has been in a lot of pressure to do something. But the hedge funds, which have given a lot of money to candidates and are spending lots of money on these ridiculous ads that I see all the time on CNBC about opposing the bailout for Puerto Rico, what Congress is talking about is not a bailout. What's going to happen is if they don't get the ability to restructure their debt, which they should have legislatively, Congress took away the right of Puerto Rico's equivalent of municipalities to go through a bankruptcy, just like other cities in the United States can, like Detroit can. Puerto Rico can't do it because Congress took away that right. If they don't have that right back, if they're not allowed to restructure their debts, then they will need a bailout. What the people who are running all these commercials, these hedge funds that are paying for all these commercials, and they're saying oppose the bailout, the irony of it is they want the bailout because the bailout money will go to the hedge funds. That's what the bailout money will be used to do, is to repay the bonds. If Puerto Rico's allowed to be restructured, they won't need a bailout because the hedge funds are going to be the ones that lose. They're trying to make it out like it's these mom and pops who are going to be the losers. No. It's all these wealthy hedge funds that are going to lose out, but they need to lose out because they never should have bought these bonds. That is the problem. People want it's heads I win, tails you lose capitalism, which is not capitalism. Look, you buy bonds from an overly indebted issuer, there's a good chance you're not going to get your money back. And when you don't get your money back, you don't go to Congress for a bailout. You just accept the fact that you gambled and you lost. And that's what these hedge funds did by buying this Puerto Rican debt. But of course, the reason that Puerto Rico has so much debt, Puerto Rico is a perfect example of how big government and easy money can destroy an economy, because that's what they did to Puerto Rico. Yes, sure. Initially, when Congress repealed the tax breaks that a lot of these pharmaceutical companies enjoyed down there, a lot of other companies, they plunged the country into a recession. But what really got them into so much debt was the Federal Reserve and the tax code. What happened? Well, Congress made Puerto Rican debt tax-free, triple tax-free. No federal, no state, no local taxes in every state in the union, all 50 states. No matter where you live, if you live in a high tax state, you buy these Puerto Rican bonds, you got zero tax. So what happened was all these muni bond funds bought up Puerto Rican bonds to put them in their portfolio. They didn't even have to really disclose that they owned them. And, as long as it's not the majority of your fund, you can be a New York tax-free fund and you can have 10, 15% of your New York tax-free fund in Puerto Rican bonds. And it's still, tax-free to New Yorkers, but they put some Puerto Rican debt in there to goose the yield because the debt in Puerto Rico had a higher coupon than the local debt. Why? Because there was more risk. But no one cares about the risk. They just want the return. They just want the money up front. They don't care about the risk they're taking in the long term. But a lot of course, Americans who own these bonds have no idea that their mutual funds bought the bonds. The problem was with the fund managers putting this toxic junk in these portfolios in the first place. Because, what do they care? It's not their money. They're just trying to get the highest current yield possible. They don't care about the risk. So you had this tremendous demand. That's the moral hazard. You have all this demand. Everybody wants Puerto Rican debt. Well, that means the Puerto Rican government has to go into debt, right, to create the bonds that all these funds want to buy, which is perfect for politicians because politicians want to bribe the voters. And see, in Puerto Rico, it's even worse because the biggest employer in Puerto Rico is the government of Puerto Rico. But the Puerto Rican employees also vote for their bosses, right? They go to the polls and they elect their bosses. Well, if your workers are going to vote to elect you, how do you get the vote of your workers? Give them a raise. Right? So Puerto Rican government is able to give out all kinds of money to Puerto Rican workers so that those Puerto Rican workers will vote them back into office. And they don't have to raise taxes and annoy the other Puerto Rican voters who don't work for government because they just borrow the money. And of course, so many people think borrowed money has no cost because, it's borrowed money. We don't have to pay it. Just have to pay the interest. And for a while, the interest is still low because it is triple tax-free. So because when interest is tax-free, you don't have to pay as much because the buyer gets the after-tax yield. So this was perfect for Puerto Rican politicians. They had a great way to to be Santa Claus, to promise all sorts of goodies to government employees in exchange for their votes. And they borrowed all this money, which all these funds were eager to load up on. But the hedge funds only got in recently. What happened was when the bond funds basically said, you know what, this is too risky, Puerto Rico, let's take our lumps, let's sell, right? That's when the hedge funds, these vulture funds started coming in and they started buying these bonds. They didn't pay par. They paid 70 cents on the dollar, 80 cents on the dollar, and now they want par. No. They're going to get a big haircut. They're going to get a bigger haircut than the original owners. But this is the problem. We created this. And to make it worse, when the Federal Reserve lowered interest rates to zero, that only increased the desire to get yield. Everybody wanted yield, and Puerto Rico had what everybody wanted, triple tax free. So this was a perfect storm of government. And then, of course, what happened in government was socialism in Puerto Rico, big government, some of it imposed by Puerto Rico itself, but a lot of it imposed upon them by the U.S. mainland. The minimum wage law. All you guys that want $15 an hour minimum wage, Puerto Rico's had that for years on a equivalent basis because the per capita income in Puerto Rico is basically less than half of what it is in the United States. So a $7.25 minimum wage in Puerto Rico is like a $15 minimum wage. So they've had it for years, and that's why hardly anybody in Puerto Rico has a job, because you can't get jobs because the minimum wage is too high. And then, of course, we crippled them with the Jones Act, which makes it so expensive to ship goods in and out of Puerto Rico. That requires the Puerto Ricans to have goods travel on U.S. flag ships, which cost a fortune. No one else in the Caribbean has to pay that kind of freight. So that means everything in Puerto Rico costs so much more than it costs on any other Caribbean island. Not only does that make it harder for the Puerto Rican residents to live because everything is expensive, but think about Puerto Rico in terms of a tourist destination. Puerto Rico has a tiny percentage of its GDP from tourism. I mean, the lowest of any island in the Caribbean. I forget what it is. Maybe it's around 3% or something. It is tiny. Puerto Rico should be the biggest tourist destination in the Caribbean. Why? You don't need a passport. Right? You can just go there with a driver's license. It speaks English. The dollar is the legal tender. It's very close. You have a lot of flights going back and forth to Puerto Rico. When you go to other Caribbean islands, a lot of times you have to transfer through Puerto Rico or some other major hub. And then, of course, you got to wait in long lines because you got to have your passport and all that. Your cell phone, when you go to Puerto Rico with a U.S. cell phone, it's not even roaming. It's free. You don't even have to pay extra for text messages or data. It's just like being in the United States. So you should have middle-class Americans flocking to Puerto Rico for a vacation. Why aren't they going there? Why do they go to other islands? And it's not because, people think it's like a gang from like a West Side Story that people don't want to go. It is a beautiful island. It's got some of the nicest beaches. They've got great surfing. They got the best surfing in the Caribbean in Puerto Rico. Most Caribbean islands, you can't even surf. There is fantastic surfing in Puerto Rico. And it's big. They've got a city. They got stuff going on. They got a nightlife. They've got a rainforest. And there's a lot to do in Puerto Rico compared to other Caribbean islands. Why doesn't Puerto Rico have a bigger tourist industry? And it's because of the minimum wage law and the Jones Act. What does that mean? That means that if you're running a hotel in Puerto Rico, number one, you've got to pay extremely high prices for labor relative to other Caribbean islands. You got to pay more for, the chambermaids. You got to pay more for the people that cook the meals, or just the people that, that hand out towels at the cabanas, whatever it is. You have a lot of people that work at a hotel, and they all collect money. Well, to hire these people in Puerto Rico, it's a lot more expensive than hiring them in some other Caribbean island. Also, all the products that they have to import, whether it's the bath products, right? The shampoos, the soaps, or they have to bring in, food that has to import, or just material, whatever they have to bring in is so much more expensive because the shipping costs are through the roof because of the Jones Act. These other Caribbean nations don't have to bring stuff in American flag ships. They can use the cheapest ships around. We're stuck with the highest cost ships around. So Puerto Rico can't compete for the budget traveler. So when people are looking for a low-cost Caribbean vacation, Puerto Rico just can't compete. So we destroyed it. We've forced Americans, instead of visiting a U.S. territory where the American citizens can have a job. We're basically forcing them to go to another island where some foreigner gets that business. That America did this. U.S. Congress did this to Puerto Rico. And we want to act like this is, has nothing to do with the minimum wage or the Jones Act. It's got everything to do with that. And this is a perfect microcosm of what's wrong with America on the mainland. And, the irony of it all, and I said this before, as broke as Puerto Rico is, America is actually more broke. On a per capita basis, even if you adjust it for relative incomes, we are more heavily in debt than Puerto Rico. The difference is our creditors don't care. Well, you know what? A few years ago, Puerto Rico's creditors, they didn't care either. They were just as broke a few years ago as they are today. They couldn't repay their debts a few years ago. It's just that no one cared that they couldn't repay, so they can keep borrowing. It's only until your creditors finally wake up that you're in trouble. Well, does that mean America's creditors are never going to wake up? Of course they are. We're going to be facing the same problem. Now, the difference is, well, we can just run the printing presses. Puerto Rico, they don't have their own independent Federal Reserve. They can't print up their own Puerto Rican dollars. They've got to use the ones that we create. And we're not doing a special QE program for Puerto Rico. Of course, we could do that, right? That their problems would be solved, right? But if America is going to say, okay, well, no one wants to loan us money anymore. We're just going to monetize all the debt. We're just going to print all the money. Well, then the dollar is going to collapse, and then it's not going to matter because we're going to be stuck because it's going to be massive inflation. It's going to be runaway inflation. And so the fact that, we haven't defaulted on our bonds isn't going to matter because the bonds are going to be worth anything anyway. But we are in the same predicament, only worse than Puerto Rico. But the bottom line is to solve the problem in Puerto Rico, not only do we need to allow Puerto Rico to restructure this debt, because there's no way the Puerto Ricans can repay it. And it's not fair to expect them to repay it because their idiot politicians who they were dumb enough to elect got them into so much debt. But the lenders, they share in the blame. You lend money to an overly indebted country that's promising basically to enslave the populace in order to repay you, you don't deserve to get your money back. If you were dumb enough to lend the money, well, then you're going to lose it. Now, I recognize a lot of Americans didn't even know they own these bonds, but that's your advisor's fault. Get a better advisor. Fire your advisor. He didn't tell you had Puerto Rican bonds in your fund. Do your homework. There's no guarantees when you invest. So even if you accidentally buy something that has these Puerto Rican bonds, you've got to bear the consequences. Hey, that's, nothing is guaranteed. It's not a sure thing. That's why you got the higher yield, because you took a risk. So we got to let the country restructure. It's not a bailout. A bailout is what happens if Congress does nothing and then the country completely collapses and then we have to write a federal check. And unfortunately, if there is a bailout, they're probably going to siphon all that money to the hedge funds that own the bonds. So I don't want any bailout for Puerto Rico. I don't want a bailout for the creditors either. I want government to get out of the way to repeal that law that they passed that said that they can avail themselves of bankruptcy. Let Puerto Rico go through a restructuring, through a bankruptcy. Let them work out a deal with the creditors so they can pay something that isn't an undue hardship on the people who are living in Puerto Rico, so you can still have an economy that works, because it can't work with all this debt. You take away a lot of the debt, the economy in Puerto Rico can work, especially if we get rid of the minimum wage and let Puerto Rico set its own minimum wage, not have to abide by the federal minimum wage. Let them set their own minimum wage and get rid of that ridiculous Jones Act that is only in there for the labor unions. Take away those two things, and Puerto Rico will thrive. In fact, given the new, Act 20 and Act 22 that they passed, which allows people to move to the island and operate businesses in a very, very low tax environment, Puerto Rico can actually boom. Puerto Rico could be the most prosperous, can be more prosperous than any U.S. state. And now, what's going on in Cuba now, opening up of Cuba. I mean, Puerto Rico is probably better positioned than any island in the Caribbean to benefit from increased tourism involving Cuba. But Congress needs to get out of the way. We don't need more government in Puerto Rico. We need a lot less government. And the only thing standing in the way of less government in Puerto Rico is probably the U.S. Congress and the hedge funds